This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Mac Loftin to the show today. He's currently a lecturer on theology at Harvard University, where he earned his PhD. He is also a columnist at the Christian Century, where he writes a monthly column about theology, politics, and current events. His research explores the intersection of Christian theology and politics in the modern West. And in his new book, In the Twilight of the Christian West, A Theology of Mourning and Resistance, Loftin offers a theological critique of contemporary Christian nationalist anxieties around secularization, immigration, and gender identity. We discuss an adapted section from the book published as the article, How Immigrants, Student Protesters, and Muslims Became the Lepers of Our Time, from Religion News Service on this episode. The article is very interesting, and I love how we connect the 13th and 14th century ostracization of groups to modern society and include some details on the life of the mystic Angela of Foligno. You can find a link to check out the book and the article from Religion News Services in the show notes of this episode. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Mac Loftin. Dr. Mac Loftin, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Good to be here.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I most recently finished my PhD in theology at Harvard at the Committee on the Study of Religion there. And prior to that, I did an MDiv at Harvard Divinity School. And went to Boston University before that, so I've kind of been in the Boston area, sort of in the kind of academic communities around Boston for a while. So I finished my PhD in 2024 and have since sort of had my adjuncting shingle out. Most recently did a graduate seminar at Harvard on Christianity and fascism. And I also do some writing. I'm an online columnist at the magazine The Christian Century, and I dabble a little bit on Substack, kind of doing my own writing. So I'm sort of doing a little writing, doing a little editing, doing a little teaching, that kind of academic in the 21st century lifestyle. And most recently, my first book came out in November from Orbis Books, is called In the Twilight of the Christian West, A Theology of Mourning and Resistance.
How has the release of that been in the last several months? How have you enjoyed that process of getting a book into the world?
Yeah, it's been really good. It's been really fun kind of having it out there, doing some talks, getting to meet readers, potential readers, and talk over the book's ideas. It grew out of my dissertation, which was about Christian theology and its relationship to fascism in the 1930s and 40s. But with the book, it is a less academic book, kind of more popular audience book. And so I wanted to talk a little bit less about the sort of intellectual history stuff that I did in my dissertation and more about contemporary politics. And so it's a kind of theological analysis of and critique of the contemporary far right. And so it has been really good to talk about that book with readers. It also has just been kind of unnerving having a book about the far right come out right now. And just it seems like really, month to month, week to week, even sometimes day to day, our political crises are just growing and growing and growing. That I think the book can help readers kind of get a better handle on and navigate the present moment. But it also is just the case that the present moment is kind of spiraling out of control so quickly that it can be hard to kind of really keep things in view.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I feel like if I don't actually read the news for 2 days, I go back and I'm completely out of touch. It is
Right.
quite
Yeah.
quite a spiraling situation, and confusing and unnerving and
Yeah.
Nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
We'll definitely get into that too. Have you done any like live events or anything with your book? Have you been out there in the world like doing any talks or anything?
Yeah, I've been doing a couple talks at some small bookstores in Massachusetts, Chicago, trying to line up some with some churches too to get some kind of religious communities to engage and get some feedback on the book. Um, and so yeah, I've been mostly doing kind of small bookstore talks.
Wonderful. Well, let's chat a little bit about your background. I would love to know a little bit about some of the major academic and intellectual turning points of your life. Tell me a little bit about the story of how you came to be interested in the topics and contents that you study as an academic.
Yeah, so things started when I was in my in undergrad and then in my master's program. I was really interested in kind of literary theory, post-structuralist kind of, classic hoity-toity French theory stuff written in, the first half of the 20th century. Um, and then when I was kind of close to finishing up my master's was around when the 2016 election happened. And I found that like all I could think about when I was doing my reading for coursework, when I was writing my papers, when I was doing other writing projects, kind of like politics was always like front and center on my mind in a way that it hadn't really been until this sort of moment of rupture or crisis. Um, and then that got me kind of thinking about these texts that I was really interested in reading, which were written in, France and Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. And the stuff that I was most interested from that time period were texts that were not directly political. They were theology texts, they were kind of literary theory texts. And yet I had this sort of light bulb moment where I was like, oh man, if I in this moment right now, in this kind of post 2016 moment, if I'm just constantly thinking about politics whenever I'm reading or writing anything, like how much more must that have been the case for people living through, even more profound crises in the 1930s and 40s. And so that kind of got me to start paying attention to, okay, well, this text might on the surface, this work of theology, this work of literary theory, this novel, whatever, it might not, it might on the surface look like it doesn't really have anything to do with politics. And yet, if I'm right that the author is probably worrying about politics at the forefront of their mind while they're writing it, then kind of what is the political dimension of this text under the surface? And so that led me to certain methodologies, like what's called political theology, which is kind of looking at the relationship between politics and theology in this kind of like subterranean kind of architectural level to try and read these seemingly non-political texts as perhaps political texts. And so that ended up being um, the kind of main thrust of my dissertation, which is trying to look at texts of sort of experimental theology being written in the 1930s and 40s as themselves works of political analysis and critique, people turning to theological writing as a way of making sense of and trying to resist the far right movements in their own day. And so then my book is kind of carrying that project forward, kind of situating myself in this lineage of anti-fascist writers in the 30s and 40s and saying, okay, well, what if we did something similar today and use theology as a mode of analysis and critique?
Excellent. And well, whenever I was looking at some of your work, you sent me an article that starts in the year 1292 in a leper colony. And I just
Yes.
wonder if you could tell listeners about the context of this piece that we're going to talk about in relation to your greater body of work.
Yeah, so this is a piece that I published recently and that is adapted from a chapter in this book, which talks about this medieval woman named Angela of Foligno, who is from 13th century Italy, kind of central Italy. And this woman, Angela Foligno, she has this book about her life that she kind of co-authored with this monk who's kind of her scribe, who was writing down the things that she was saying. And in one episode of this book of her life, she talks about traveling outside the town of Foligno, where she spent most of her life, to a leper colony nearby. Um, and she goes to this leper colony. She says that she's going there to find Christ. She says to her friend, maybe we'll find Christ in this leper colony. And they bring some food and some blankets, and they go to the leper colony. They hand out the blankets, they hand out the food, and then she says that she is going to wash the hands and feet of these lepers at the leper colony. And so she washes their hands and feet. And then she makes a special point to note one man who she says his hands and his feet were the phrase that she uses, she says they were in an advanced state of decomposition. And
Mhm.
so pieces of his hands and feet were kind of falling off into the bowl of water that she was using to wash him and the others. And then she ends this episode with this kind of really shocking sort of out of nowhere. She says, and then I picked up the bowl and I drank it, and the a piece of skin that had broken off of him kind of got lodged in my throat, and I swallowed it down, and it felt like I took communion. And then I went home, and then she never mentions this again. And so my article is kind of taking this bizarre and like really disturbing and honestly pretty gross
Yes,
passage.
graphic.
Yeah, pretty graphic, pretty gnarly passage from Angela's book, and is trying to read that as like kind of what I was talking about of the method I use in the book as a whole, kind of taking this moment in the history of theology as a lens through which we can better understand and also possibly resist far right politics in our own day. As big as the disjunction is between 1292 and today, I do think Angela, and in particular this story about the leper colony, has really interesting political and theological implications for today.
Yeah, so let's go in more to that. How does Angela's action, how does that give modern people in 2026 in the US or the West or whatever, how does Angela's action give us something that we can strive to do in our own lives?
Yeah, so I think to understand that and to understand kind of why I make this weird insistence that like this, Angela of Foligno's book from the 13th century is an extremely important political text for the 21st century, it helps to understand like what the position of lepers was in medieval Christian society. And
Hmm.
so we like when we think about lepers, we might think of it as being a sort of medical category above all, that it was some sort of disease that doctors were diagnosing and thinking about medically. And that's just not the case. Lepers were not really primarily thought of as a medical category. Like it makes much more sense to think of them as just a general category of exclusion, that there were kind of similar practices that were brought against lepers were brought against other communities, other people who were thought of as being outsiders. And so to make things a little bit more concrete, so lepers were subjected to this really intense regime of surveillance. They were constantly monitored, watched, organized in particular ways, expelled from communities, kind of enclosed in their own separate communities outside of the major cities. They were forced to wear particular identifying clothing so that people could see from a far way off that they were lepers. There were all these restrictions on the kinds of interactions that non-lepers could have with lepers. And these were all the exact same strategies that were brought against other excluded minority groups, in particular, people who were labeled heretics, Jews, and people who at the time were labeled with this kind of new label of the sodomite. We today obviously wouldn't use that term. That was kind of the term that was being used at the time as this kind of label of exclusion. So these were all these different categories of difference that were then subjected to the exact same regime of surveillance, identifying clothing, certain rules about how to interact with people, exclusion, having their property expropriated, enclosed in kind of ghettos on the outskirts of town. And one really interesting thing that happened with all these different groups is like as these similar strategies of labeling and exclusion and violence were visited on these different groups, the groups themselves stopped being thought of as being distinct groups. They kind of all
Hmm.
sort of blurred together into just this sort of amorphous them, the people who were excluded. And so leprosy and heresy were both thought of as being sexually transmitted diseases. Um, like the symptoms of leprosy was thought of as being like hypersexuality that could lead to practices that got labeled as sodomy, which was
Hmm.
also thought of as being a kind of character trait of Jews. So there were all these different, like these categories just all sort of blurred together, where like lepers were thought of as sort of the same thing as heretics, which were thought of as sort of the same thing as Jews, which were thought of as sort of the same thing as the sodomites. These categories kind of blurred together and just became the them against which a Christian society's us could make sense. We know who we
Mm.
are because we are not them, and they're all the same. They're just the enemies, they're the outside.
There's
And so
so
the
many modern
reason
examples too, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is why I sort of really have been reading Angela a lot over the last couple of years, is because this is a similar strategy that we see happening today, where we see these kind of different categories of difference and of exclusion blur together in ways that can be really confusing and bewildering and really hard to make sense of. And so I think of you can think of like right-wing politics or politicians who will get up and say, "Oh, we found, Muslim prayer mats on the Mexican border, and also, there are Chinese military males crossing over the border, and they're turning people trans or something," where it's like all these
Right.
different categories of hostility get blurred together, where it's like, "Oh, immigrants, they're Latin American, but they're also Chinese, but they also have these Muslim prayer mats, and they're also queer or something." And like all these different categories of difference and hostility blur together. And so I turn to Angela as a way to make sense of, okay, well, why is this happening? Why is this kind of blurring of enemies happening? And what do we do about it? And I think the blurring is happening for just the same way that I was talking about in the medieval context of, well, to define a community, to define an us, you have to have a them. You have to have a, who we are not them. And so that them, the different categories of people that get lumped into that them can lose their difference among themselves and just kind of become a big amorphous them. And so I think Angela, the medieval context of the lepers and Angela can help us kind of make sense of that inability to distinguish between different categories of enemy, but also Angela's response, which is really important, which is she says, "Oh, I'm looking for Christ. I'm going to go to the leper colony. I'm going to leave the walls of the city of Foligno and go to this place where these excluded people are."
Yeah. And then you can see it in examples around the world too with the exclusion. Like you think about the walls surrounding the Gaza Strip, you know what I mean? Or the
Yes, yeah.
checkpoints in Jerusalem into the West Bank. I mean, there's so many examples that one can point to all over the world.
Yeah, and in that context, it's like different minority groups of like Palestinians and Bedouins and Muslims and Druze, these kind of different categories, all just sort of get lumped together as like, oh, that's all them and not
Right.
us.
Yeah. Okay. So let's fast forward like 30 years from 1292 when the original article happens to 1321. In the article, you talk about something regarding Jews and lepers versus Christians. And I'm curious if you can just kind of keep us going in this story in the 13th and 14th century, because it's really interesting in the connections that you're making to today.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens is the like I was saying, these kind of categories get blurred together and these different groups of outsiders get thought of as being sort of the same thing. And so one really interesting thing that happens is these like bizarre conspiracy theories that start swirling around these different excluded categories. And so one thing that happens in the 14th century is that this conspiracy theory grips France at the time, that people start thinking that Jews and lepers are working together, that they're kind of meeting in secret to poison all of the wells in France and kill all the Christians. And this ends up in like actual communities, Jewish communities, also leper colonies, having these acts of mass violence brought against them. and the property taken and confiscated by the state and by the Christian communities. And so there's this kind of like this bizarre conspiracy theorizing that I think also forms a kind of parallel today, where you see these different excluded minority groups that don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, being these sort of fantasies being cooked up of them working together against the Christian nation. Like you have, you know, Chinese communist secret agents are working with immigrant charities to bring down the US, or like, Jewish elites are working with queer people to, give hormone replacements to children. These just conspiracy theories that make no sense if you think about them for 1 second, but they kind of follow this logic of, well, the excluded outside, these boundaries don't really matter. These categories of exclusion, they all sort of blend together. And so they must all be working together against us.
Mm. Okay, so as you have talked about a few minutes ago, there is a constant flooding of the zone, basically, with
Right.
nonstop events that are happening in our society and in our news cycles every single day, and it's paralyzing for a lot of people in the
Yeah.
country at the
Yeah.
moment. What is your routine like for paying attention to what this current political climate is doing, what the current political administration is doing in the U.S.? How do you go about this in a way that doesn't make you lose your mind?
Well, I don't know if I found that. The way I go about it, it does seem to make me feel like I'm losing my mind. I have the vice of scrolling social media too much. But I do try and kind of curate my social media follows to people who are kind of in the communities that are being impacted. So trying to follow, people who are in Gaza, or most recently people who are in Minneapolis or something, who can kind of talk about their experience um, day to day, sort of on the ground, so to speak. But I also, there are some news sites that I do trust. I like Foreign Exchanges and Drop Site, both of which publish on Substack, which is not a great platform, but they do have a lot of good journalists who use that site. And then I do still kind of scroll the big news sites like New York Times and Washington Post, but I try and take those, especially when they talk about foreign policy, with a big ol' big ol' spoonfuls of salt.
Yeah.
But I try and kind of, read widely and also read very critically, and try and find particular journalists and outlets like Dropsite, that I think has been doing really trustworthy work.
So, Mac, tell me a little bit about your view of somebody who studies ancient events and societies in relation to religion and then trying to connect it today. Why do you think what you're doing is super important? I think it's important, obviously, because
Yeah.
I invited you here, but
Yeah,
tell
thank you.
listeners a little bit about why you think that studying the ancient and making connections to today matters.
Yeah, I think that the danger with it is that it can lead to an assumption that history sort of repeats itself or is static or something, and so that you can predict the future by studying the past. That, oh, I know what's going to happen next because I've seen what happened before. That is, I think, the wrong way to do it. I think the right way to do it is to study the ways in the past that people actually struggled to understand their own present moment. The way that people were similarly to how we are feeling, kind of bewildered, overwhelmed, confused, feeling like you're sort of wrestling in the dark with something you don't quite understand, and yet trying to find a way to move forward, to live together, to kind of make some sort of livable future in their own very different way. And so I find that the the parallels with the past, again, are less in terms of like concrete events that give us some sort of insight, but instead the parallels are with people in the past who shared our lack of insight. And
Mm,
and so I try to look for models of how to kind of muddle through things. Like the example of Angelo Foligno. Angelo Foligno was not someone who had a very clear sight of like the Italian state. Well, there wasn't an Italian state, but the sort of the
Mhm.
state of Foligno, the city politics of Foligno. She was not someone who had a really good insight in that, and she was not someone who really, was giving kind of concrete political advice of, here's the policy on, you know, lepers that we need to have here in our city of Foligno. She was not giving sort of prescriptive political advice. But what she was doing was sort of muddling through this situation in which people were being subjected to acts of exclusion and violence. And she was nonetheless trying to figure out some way of relating to those people and seeing herself as being in community with those people, seeing those people as being within her sphere of moral concern. Um, and so that sort of approach of like looking at people in the past for how they tried to kind of have uh, you know a sort of responsible life in conditions that made responsibility extremely difficult. That I think is the proper way to study the past.
Excellent. Well, Mac, you also are doing a lot of work with public scholarship. You
Yes.
mentioned that your book is sort of a public-facing mass book anyway, and you publish on websites like Religion News Service, where I read some
Mhm.
of your work. Tell me a little bit about your focus on public scholarship and why you're doing that.
Yeah, I think that writing for the public is really important for academics because it can get us outside of this kind of preaching to the choir or sort of preaching to the guild of academia. Um, and I think that's a problem because academia is a place in which professional success too often hinges on navigating these really tight and kind of arcane hierarchies, and these sort of personal networks of who knows who and all that stuff. And people outside the academy don't care about those. They don't care about who your advisor's advisor was. They don't care about who, your professor got into a fight with at a conference 20 years ago. They don't care about that kind of stuff in a way that like you do have to care about that stuff if you're going to navigate the kind of professional ladder of academia. And so I think it's always good to expose one's work and one's scholarship to that broader perspective of people who aren't going to care about the inside baseball academia stuff, because they're going to be able to read the work kind of more on its own terms. And so I think that we tend to think of writing for the public as there's this kind of bad reputation that it has of like dumbing things down for people who haven't done as much homework as we have in the academy. And I think it's actually the opposite. I think that to communicate your work to the public, you have to kind of like smarten things up because you're writing for an audience who is not going to know all of the kind of arcane patronage network stuff that you've been navigating in the academy. And so you just have to present the work on its own terms.
Yeah. How do you see the risks of reporting on what you do? Because you mentioned that there are some. There's a potential
Yeah.
for bad things to come your way. How do you navigate that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think like definitely the risks of kind of writing, especially doing a sort of critical reflection on current events or something, that there are risks and the risks are probably greater now than they have been in a while, as we're seeing more of a crackdown on speech critical of the current administration and its policies. Um, but I think also at the same time, academics, we tend to have a tendency to overestimate our reach and impact and how many people are reading our work and really, having their lives impacted by it. So I think also, as much as there are risks, I think the risks might not be as great as we might fear them to be. And so that's all the more reason to speak out, to kind of really lend your academic expertise to these public conversations, and to not kind of retreat behind like, well, the risks are really great, so I'm not going to do it. I think that we in the academy were privileged to have a space where we can really do a lot of that homework, where we can really sit with the library and sit in the archives and do this kind of deep research. And so that privilege comes with a responsibility to then like share the fruits of that research with other people.
Yeah, I get a real kick and thrill out of doing things that are slightly critical on this podcast. So for me, this is kind of an almost like an adrenaline junkie outlet.
Yeah.
What do you have in the pipeline? What are you working on?
So I have a monthly-ish column at the Christian Century. It's monthly-ish. I have a lot of stay-at-home dad duties, so I think
Mhm.
that I'm not able to always get those out as on as timely of a schedule as I would want. But I try and reflect kind of month to month on current events, how things are going, and kind of bring my the perspective of a theologian to current events. So keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on the Christian Century and the monthly columns there. I'm kind of I having just finished my first book. I'm in the very early stages of thinking about a second book. I don't want to describe it too much because it's very early stages. But I'm thinking of writing about the ways that childhood and infancy are thought of in theology, and with a particular eye to the climate crisis and this kind of recurring fantasy that people have that the children will save us or that future generations will save us. And so, what is that kind of fantasy that associates childhood with future salvation? What are the theological roots of that? What other theological resources might there be for thinking about that? Um, and then I have a Substack that I sometimes write on. It has lain fallow for a while since I've been doing this monthly column at the Century. But I have been meaning to kick that back up again. So stay tuned. There might be stuff on the Substack at some point.
Go ahead and plug that book again. Tell everybody the title and where to get it.
Yes, so the book that recently came out is called In the Twilight of the Christian West, A Theology of Mourning and Resistance. And that is by Orbis Books. Like I said, it's a kind of theological critique of the international dimension of Christian nationalism. We tend to think of Christian nationalism as being a strictly American thing, but it's really a global project. And so I'm trying to give a theological analysis and critique of it. Um, and yes, that's out. That came out in November from Orbis Books. It is sold at least online. I think it is. I don't know if I can say it's wherever books are sold, but it is at least on whatever websites books are sold.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Mac Loftin, thank you so much for joining me on Classical Ideas to talk
Yeah, thanks,
about your
Greg.
work. I was really excited to talk about Angela Foligno, the mystic, because I've never talked about her on this podcast ever. So I'm delighted that you have filled in a little gap in the topics
Which
that
is
I have
great.
never
Yeah.
discussed here. Really
Might be the
appreciate
first
it.
time that eating scabs was talked about on this podcast
Oh
too.
man, I was ready for that moment. So thank you for bringing the graphic detail. I really appreciate it. But
Yeah.
Dr. Mac Loftin, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Greg.